Start the roll call. All right, good morning, Colorado. It is November 3rd. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission hearing. We will gather here today to hear the 900 series from staff. And we will start with a roll call. Hearings Manager Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Putnam.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Excellent. And we have 73 parties that have joined us. So welcome, everybody. We are going to go into the 900 series, but before we do that, I think we have a couple of procedural matters that we should take up with regard to calendars, et cetera, over the course of the last several weeks that are ahead of us. Director Murphy.
Chairman Robbins. You want me to jump in?
I think we want to talk about timing for 900 series,
Correct.
the 2 through 6 final vote, and the 1200 series calendars.
Yes, sir. So today staff has about a 30-minute presentation for commissioners and has all the time in the world to talk through any of those changes. The rules and the SPP have gone to the parties at this point in time and should be available on the website. We are recommending, commissioners, that we actually convene on Thursday, November 5th at 9 a.m. to begin party responses to staff's, the changes proposed today. And we'll work through the party response statements and then move into commissioner deliberations. If it's possible to wrap that up by Thursday night, that's great. If not, we would convene on Monday. So we would not be convening on Friday, November 6th. And so I think that should be the sum total of the 900 series at that point in time. On Friday, November 6th, staff will be releasing the revised SBP for the 2 through 600 series that reflects the commission deliberations and discussion on the rules that we took a preliminary vote on a couple weeks ago. We would also, staff at that point in time put out any conforming edits necessary based on 8 and 9 in particular. And then we would suggest that the commissioners take up a final vote on the 2 through 600 series rules at 9:30 on Tuesday, November 10th. And then
Director Murphy, just a quick question. The 10th is the necessary date for final action in order to have an effective date on the January 1st. Is that right?
That is my understanding, yes.
Okay, just getting that out there for the world to understand why we're getting back to the 2 through 6 before we finish up the 12 or the 8,
Yes.
9, 12, excuse me.
Yes. And after the final vote on 2 through 600, I anticipate we would break for lunch, reconvene at, I believe, 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday, November 10th to take public comment on the 1200 or wildlife rules. That would run into the evening, so long as we have public commenters, and Ms. Larson probably knows a lot more about those logistics. We will not be meeting on Wednesday, November 11th, as it's Veterans Day, or in observance of Veterans Day. And then we would reconvene on Thursday, November 12th.
Trying to bring up a calendar here, Ms. Murphy, so that we can all see it.
It's probably easier than listening to me. We would reconvene on Thursday, November 12th at 9 a.m. for staff and CPW to present the 1200 series rules, and then jump straight from that into party presentations on the 12th, running into the 13th. We anticipate, and it will depend on commissioner questions and party presentations, but party closing comments and commission direction to staff on Monday, November 16th. And then currently we would anticipate staff presenting its revisions based on the commissioner direction on Wednesday, November 18th. If it's at all possible for staff to do that earlier, we will, recognizing that parties need time to digest it before we jump into party closing statements on the revised 1200 series on Thursday, November 19th. On Friday, November 20th, we anticipate taking up the commissioner final deliberation on 1200 series, and then taking the final vote on the 800, 900, 1200 series votes. Again, that would need to take place on Friday, November 20th. And with that, that is the next couple of weeks as I see them, Chair.
Great. So the one thing that's missing, the two edits to the slide that I'm showing are on the 18th, you might try to get this, or I'm sorry, yeah, we might try to go a little earlier if possible, and that's just to be determined. And then on the 20th, we're doing final deliberations on the 12th, but we're also going to do final vote on 8, 9, and 12. And
Yes,
the
Chair.
20th is our hard stop in order to have effective date on 15th, I believe.
We may have a few more days, but I would really like all of us to have some quiet time over the Thanksgiving week. I can't remember the exact date, but
Okay. But we'll do our best to be done with 8, 9, and 12 on the 20th. Do commissioners have questions about any of the next couple of weeks' calendars? All right, great. Did a great job of getting that out there. That lines us up. So I believe we are turning to your staff for a presentation.
thank you, Chair. And I would ask Ms. Amaro to get the slides queued up, and would thank commissioners, staff, the parties, and all the Coloradans listening in today. Today is an important day in our work on this mission change rulemaking, but it's also a very important day for us to all exercise our civic duty of voting if you haven't already. So quick reminder, I'll try to keep my remarks short so that if people need to get out and vote, they can. As I said, we're here today to present staff's revisions to the 900 series based on the Commission's direction. We were able in the intervening few days to have a few focused discussions with some key stakeholders. And as with all of both this series, the 900 series, and all of the rest of the rules, we have worked incredibly closely with our partners at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment on these revisions. Next slide, please. So these 4 rule provisions I've pulled out as kind of the big picture substantive items for discussion today in my estimation. On this slide, these rules are presented to you chronologically. However, today we are not going to go in a chronological order. With rule series, we're going to focus instead on kind of subject matter and presenter, because there are a number of kind of grab bag changes, and we wanted to have a more organized presentation. So work with us as we jump back and forth between rules or issues, please. On 903D3, the options for venting and flaring at existing rules, we considered your direction and have proposed options for the timing of the Form 4. If you recall, we had a lot of discussion about when a Form 4 to request an additional 12 months of flaring must come in, and if there's a drop dead date by which it can no longer allow staff to approve venting and flaring on that Form 4. As you will hear today, staff has recommended to you that we consider rolling submittals and rolling approvals and expirations. And so that will be discussed in more detail, but wanted to flag for you that it is staff's recommendation that these be done on a rolling basis instead of maybe a hard stop on flaring. Next, on 903D6, again, we had some very key communications with stakeholders and the air quality folks. I think that these revisions to the pit emissions reflect a very important issue for staff and for Colorado. I think that the work that staff, or the direction that staff is implementing and proposing to you today continues the work of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to protect public health and environment by controlling emissions, but also provides flexibility, recognizing that there are times when pits, and in particular for recycling and reuse of produced water, is important. Through this process, we have also learned that there is a lot to learn about pit emissions and controls in particular. So if you will note on page 34 of the statement on basis and purpose red line, staff has outlined a suggestion that we convene a work group on pit emissions that would be informed by the data that staff is proposing that will be collected pursuant to 903 D6C, and that we learn from this process in concert with the rest of our stakeholders. On 904, I'll discuss that in a little more detail shortly. And then on Rule 909, we are proposing revisions to the produced water sampling requirements. And we also looked hard at the issue of multi-well pits and centralized E&P waste management facilities. We've considered what we know based on existing rules and the existing operation of certain pits in certain parts of the state that have demonstrated different risk profiles in other multi-well pits and E&P waste management facilities. So Greg will talk through some of the changes that we are proposing to staff's draft in light of the party presentations, the discussion with commissioners, and also our re-review of the issue. We also will take time to talk about some changes to flaring, other changes to Rule 903. Mr. Leonard will talk about commencement of production operations, and we'll conclude with kind of a grab bag of other issues on which we received commission direction. And throughout this, we will talk a bit about conforming changes. So with that, next slide, please. As I suggested, I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about revisions to Rule 904. And I know I perhaps was a bit of a storm crow last week, panicking about the scope of what could be collected and presented as part of a Rule 904 cumulative impacts analysis. We've made a couple of key changes that I think really implement direction from the commission and also reflect concerns that we've heard from Colorado stakeholders in a way that I think is implementable. So a couple of key changes in my estimation are in 904A, changing from providing a report to allowing the director to report the following information. I think that provides some flexibility so we don't need, a giant binder of documents that's all stapled together that has all these different components, but instead can be more fluid or presented to you, which complements a change that I'll talk about shortly. We heard the importance of considering wildlife resources, high priority habitat, and water volume. And so we've built that into the CIDR reporting requirement in subpart A. We also heard suggestions about clarifications and improvements to the language in 2 around what can and should be brought to this commission about the work done by APCD and AQCC to achieve Colorado statewide greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So we made those changes. We also built in a few additional components of the cumulative impacts reporting requirement that relate to information about new or evolving innovative technologies, reports published by other governmental agencies. And again, that helps us bring together information to you to consider as you look at how to shape the regulatory environment in Colorado for oil and gas development. The third one is the catch-all that we discussed, and any information that is requested by the commission or that the director determines is relevant. Lastly, I made a couple of changes to subpart 8 to ensure that the staff recommendations don't need to only be rulemaking. There are different places where we need to explore opportunities in my estimation. Those can include guidance and work group or studies. So I think that just provides us more flexibility, and I think that's an appropriate way to help us inform ourselves about the changes that we may propose moving forward. So with that, next slide, please. We also heard a lot of discussion about 904B and trying to tailor it and make it more clear and implementable in my estimation. And so we took that direction back and have tried to explain that we're really looking at studies that would be related to the oil and gas location or oil and gas locations within the oil and gas development plan at issue. I hope that this helps provide some certainty for folks and comfort that, we're not going to ask an operator proposing a single well vertical on the Eastern Plains to look at sage grouse in Garfield County, for example. So the last change, and I think that this is one of the most interesting and exciting ones, is in 904C. in that the commission may establish an informational docket on its own motion to explore different components. This is something that we have talked about as an opportunity over the course of the last couple of years as we need to investigate different issues, but we haven't had quite the right tool to do it. And now I think that we do. So I think that this is a really wise suggestion that can inform a lot of pieces. And in my estimation, this subpart C complements the idea of reporting to the commission, right? That informational docket could be the report on the innovative changes to tie us back to the conversation we had last week. So that's an overview of the changes that staff is recommending on Rule 904 in light of commission direction and party comments. With that, next slide, please. I wanted to just reiterate staff's request that the commission support changes to Rule 909F and 1202A4. Obviously, 1202A4 will also be for further discussion in the 1200 series, but wanted to make sure that the complementary components of the rule changes are before you. Again, in 904F, it would be striking and existing and unless waived by CPW pursuant to Rule 1202A. The language in the blue red line in subpart 4 is actually language in 1202A. So just reiterating this, I know I've talked about it a lot, but I can't help myself. Next slide, please. And with that, mostly concludes my opening kind of overview of where we're going, and wanted to take a moment to talk to you about where we're going for the rest of staff's presentation. Mr. Duranlo will take over from me to talk about 903D6, the pit emissions, and talk about the substantive changes that staff is proposing, to also talk about 909G with the multi-well pit and centralized EMP waste management facility that I identified. Mr. Duranlo will turn it over to Mr. Leonard to talk about commencement of production operation as well as well liquids unloading. And if you recall, that's a discussion around when does a Form 42 notice need to come to staff for well liquids unloading, given some of the comments that we heard both from local governments and operators about timing. Mr. Leonard will turn it over to Mr. Axelson, our East Environmental Supervisor, to talk about staff's proposed changes in light of your direction to the sampling, produced water sampling requirements and the frequency of those in large part. And Mr. Axelson will then turn it over to Mr. Miner to talk about a couple of really big issues around flaring, some prefatory language, or prefatory language as I've now learned it is, not prefatory, and venting and flaring. That's the timing question. When do the Form 4s come in and what is staff's latitude to approve them? He will then close out with what I would say are kind of the grab bag of issues that we are proposing in light of the direction that you provided to us. With that, Mr. Duranlo.
Thank you, Director. Good morning, Commissioners. First, I'm going to describe the changes proposed to Rule 903D6, and then I'll cover Rule 909G, as Director Murphy indicated. On 903D6, which covers pit emissions during production operations, staff heard your feedback on this rule, and we have incorporated it into what we believe is a solution that will facilitate compliance while achieving the emission reductions goals. Reducing emissions from pits is an important part of addressing the overall emissions profile of oil and gas development. Volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, contribute to ozone generation, and the hazardous air pollutants pose a health hazard to people nearby. First, we heard that you were comfortable with emissions limits for new pits statewide and more restrictive limits in certain areas. We believe this is consistent with the emission change mandate of SB 19181. So we have written this section to prohibit emissions greater than 2 tons per year of VOCs within 2,000 feet of a building unit or designated outdoor activity area, and within the 9-county area of the North Front Range ozone non-attainment area. We were careful to craft this language to address new pits and buildings units in existence at the time the pit is put into service. At your direction, we made it clear that a new home built next to an existing pit does not retroactively change the compliance requirements or move the goalposts for that pit. We also kept the proposed statewide emissions limit on all new pits of 5 tons of VOCs per year. Now, we heard loud and clear that pits can be a critical piece of infrastructure for recycling and reuse of produced water, and pits designed and constructed and operated for that purpose on the West Slope will not meet those stringent emission standards. So with your guidance, we crafted an exception to the statewide limit on new pits to allow for reuse and recycling of produced water to help alleviate the burden on freshwater resources. As proposed, the operation would need to be approved as part of a reuse and recycling plan, tying this rule to Rule 905A3, and the pit would need to be connected to a centralized distribution system to minimize trucking of water. We did not explicitly require that all water be piped, as it may not be feasible in every instance, but any proposal would be subject to rigorous review. One other component that we felt was important for all pits, but especially for those pits subject to this exception, is for the operator to use up-to-date technologies to minimize the emissions from the pits. And moving on to existing pits in 903D6B, we retained the concept that pits will be subject to emissions limits and should be evaluated to determine what their actual emissions are. We established a 5 tons per year limit for existing pits, but provided 2 options as off-ramps. First, if the pit is used for reuse and recycling of produced water, subject to a reuse and recycling plan under Rule 905A3, then staff may approve a higher emission standard. Second, for pits that are not used for reuse and recycling, any exception to the 5 tons per year limit would be subject to staff review and consultation with our partners at the Air Pollution Control Division. Because it would be an impossible undertaking to evaluate and address over 3,000 active pits all at once, we have proposed a phased implementation consistent with the pit water quality analysis requirements of Rule 909J. Next slide, please. In order to achieve a reasonable outcome, staff proposes this timeline to demonstrate compliance. Between now and the effective date of the rules, COGCC staff will prepare preliminary guidance on estimating pit emissions. There are some models available, and operators may have experience doing the same exercise elsewhere. And as explained in the SBP and mentioned by Director Murphy, staff will engage a working group to evaluate methods for emissions estimates, available control technologies, and if necessary, future regulatory initiatives. Rule 909J, the Produced Water Quality Sampling Rule, gives operators until July 2022 to collect and submit produced water quality analyses. In addition to providing statewide data, which can be used to evaluate a pit's potential to release contaminants to the soil, surface water, or groundwater, these data will be useful for emissions calculations. Staff established the same date in July 2022 as the final deadline for submitting any requests for increased pit emissions, which will afford staff 6 months to evaluate and review all the requests. After January 2023, all pits will be subject to the 5 tons per year VOC emissions limits, unless the pit has received specific approval for higher emissions. Next slide, please. Switching gears now, I'd like to address some cleanup that staff has made to Rule 909G to address some inadvertent compliance concerns that resulted from some imprecise past rule language and minor wording changes, which led to significant meaning changes. Proposed 909G was modified from current Rule 902E, and 902E imposes a 3-year limit on the use of multi-well pits. This rule came from the desire to clarify a distinction between centralized E&P waste management facilities and multi-well pits which were intended for shorter-term use. As modified in 2008, Rule 902E had always been intended and implemented such that it did not bring in disposal pit complexes in the eastern counties of Colorado. The requirements for these multi-well pits were exempted from various requirements in Huerfano, Los Animas, Logan, Morgan, Washington, and Yuma counties. And you heard directly from some stakeholders in those areas last week. Staff has carried forward the somewhat confusing compliance dates of May 1st, 2011 for Huerfano and Yuma counties and May 1st, 2013 for the other 4 counties to conform with regulatory changes that had been made in 2008 and 2013. Based on a review of the rules pertaining to multi-well pits and centralized E&P waste management facilities, staff is proposing to revise both of those definitions and modify Rule 909G to carve out those counties once again. However, as we know, not all produced water is alike, and not all pits represent the same level of risk. Therefore, staff has proposed, consistent with our recommendations for site-specific review of pits for fencing and netting, and the case-by-case evaluation of pit emissions, that staff be able to place more stringent operating requirements on a pit, including lining, requiring a Form 28, or even requiring closure of a pit in the most extreme circumstances. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Mike Leonard, Compliance Unit Manager. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo, and good morning, Commissioners. Let's discuss where we landed. Next slide, please. Sorry. Thank you. Let's discuss where we landed with regard to commencement of production operations and well liquids unloading. First, the definition of commencement of production operations. There may be times when a well is capable of producing separable or saleable product, and that production may be conducted with permanent or temporary equipment, or a combination of both. Staff feels that the type of equipment in use is not as important as the consistent flow of product to sales. In the early stages of well completion, this separation or salability may not be of a consistent nature. In other words, the sales flow is on and off. Staff incorporated into the SPP that the well must be selling for a consistent period of time for commencement of production operations to begin. And these determinations may have to be made on a case-by-case basis upon review of records. We also understand that AQCC uses the same term in their regulations. However, for COGCC, we're using it in a different context as it relates to other COGCC rules, such as lighting and noise. Next slide, please. As to Rule 903E1E, which is the requirement to submit a Form 42 notice for well liquid unloading, staff feels it's important to understand how often and where liquid unloading events occur. This understanding will aid in identifying best management practices and potential patterns for areas where unloading may become more common. Identifying these patterns may enable other technologies to be incorporated earlier. To be clear, as stated in the SPP, staff intends well liquid unloading events to be only manual unloading events. In other words, a worker must physically manipulate the production equipment to allow the well to unload to a tanker vessel. 48-hour notice would be the ideal scenario. However, staff understands that unloading may need to be performed in a more rapid manner than that 48-hour notice would allow. The concern being that if not unloaded sooner, it could cause the additional use of swabbing equipment and more time to place the well back into normal production. This in turn can ultimately cause more emissions. Therefore, staff concluded that receiving notice within 2 hours of the procedure is adequate if waiting would require alternative or extended procedures. Any notice received by COGCC will be forwarded to the relevant local government electronically as well. And in that light, a conforming edit to Rule 405S must also be made. And now I'll turn it over to Mr. Axelson.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm going to discuss the changes to Rule 909J proposed during staff's opening presentation. And 909J is the sampling and analysis of produced water managed in pits. So the first change was fairly minor. It included the addition of total suspended solids to the list of analytes. This with the total dissolved solids and the radium 226 and 228 results will allow operators to make a conversion from the liquid concentration to the dry concentration, which is needed to compare to the CDPHE T-norm standard that will determine if the produced water can be exempted from the T-norm regulations. In Rule 909J6, the operator can request to consolidate the number of samples if they have multiple multiple wells producing from the same formations in the same field to the same pit. Next slide, please. Also, as previously discussed, we developed Rule 909J2 for subsequent sampling and analysis of produced water. This was an important addition to determine if the characteristics of the produced water were changing over time, so that we could determine if mitigation such as lining or fencing and netting would be required as appropriate in the future. For lined pits, the operator will collect an initial sample, then 3 years later, collect a second sample. For unlined pits, the operator will collect and analyze samples on an annual basis after the initial sample. We do have some data that suggests produced water quality from certain formations and certain basins may be very consistent over time. As a result, we've provided an off-ramp if the sampling and analysis demonstrates stable water quality over time. In that case, the operator may request relief from future sampling. For all pits, the operator will analyze a subsequent sample anytime a new well contributes water to the pit. The director will also have discretion to require subsequent sampling anytime there's reason to believe the water quality has changed. And last, if the subsequent sampling indicates variable water quality, the director may request sampling on a more frequent basis. And now I'll turn it over to AHG Minor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Axelson. And if we could go on to the next slide, please. I will now take us back to a few elements of Rule 903 that were not already covered. So first, consistent with the Commission's directions, staff revised the definition of flaring. Staff consulted on multiple occasions with the Air Pollution Control Division about this change, and the revised definition simply states that flaring is the combustion of natural gas. Natural gas continues to refer to produced gas that originates in a well, not flash gas that volatilizes or evaporates from crude oil. Rather than listing the exceptions to flaring in the definition itself, staff has revised the statement of basis and purpose to describe the specific categories of combustion that would qualify as flaring, and this will also be further spelled out in guidance. So this really addresses the suggestions from both the citizen groups as well as from industry parties on that definition. Next slide, please. So as directed by the Commission, staff has added preparatory language to the beginning of Rule 903 that explains the rule's purpose and the Commission's intent. It acknowledges that venting and flaring are a waste of natural gas and also pose risks to safety in the environment. This is consistent with the statutory definitions of waste found in Colorado Revised Statute, Section 34, 60, 103, subparts 11 through 13, and the statutory prohibition on waste found in Section 107 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. And I apologize for the dog background noise there. The preface also states that venting and flaring are prohibited except where otherwise allowed by Rule 903. This is not a substantive change. As proposed, Rule 903 prohibited venting and flaring, subject to various exceptions during drilling, completion, and production phases of oil and gas operations. Based on the Commission's deliberations and in the Statement of Basis and Purpose, staff has added language specifying that the Commission intends for operators to flare rather than vent natural gas, unless Rule 903 explicitly allows venting. Next slide, please. Rule 903D3 prohibits routine venting and flaring subject to a 12-month grace period. Operators must submit and obtain staff approval of a Form 4 to continue venting or flaring during the grace period. As directed, staff provided multiple options for the Commission to decide between, both for the beginning date and the end date of the 12-month period. For submission date, staff proposed 4 options: the date a currently approved Form 4 expires, the 900 series effective date, or 30 or 60 days from that effective date. As a reminder, since 2016, notice to operators regarding Rule 912 has required operators to request permission to vent and flare by submitting a Form 4 with roughly the same information required by Rule 903D3A through E. The notice to operators allows staff to approve these requests for a maximum period of 1 year. So, all operators that are currently venting and flaring should already be subject to an approved Form 4. that will expire at some point in the next year. Because of this, staff's preferred option is option 1, which will stagger the submission, review, and approval of requests to continue venting and flaring throughout the course of 2021, rather than all of them being submitted at the same time. Receiving all the Form 4s simultaneously would create significant workload challenges for engineering staff. Staff similarly proposed 2 options for the end of the 12-month period, either 12 months from the date the Form 4 is approved, or having all Form 4s allow venting and flaring only through January 15th, 2022, regardless of the date they're approved. Staff prefers option A, the staggered option, which is also based on workload concerns. If all Form 4s expire on the same date, the Commission might be inundated with simultaneous requests for variances at its hearings in early January of 2022, which is the same time that the Commission is scheduled to receive staff's report on cumulative impacts under Rule 904. In addition to proposing options for the submission and end date, staff also revised Rule 903D3 to account for scenarios in which an operator unexpectedly loses access to a gathering line, which has occurred in the past, although very infrequently. Because the options proposed for Rule 903D3 would limit the rule to Form 4s submitted in 2021, it would no longer account for a situation where an operator loses access to a gathering line in 2022 or farther into the future. Staff therefore added language requiring operators to submit a Form 4 within 30 days of losing access to a gathering line, regardless of the year when that happens. Next slide, please. In Rule 905A3, staff proposed a minor conforming edit to reflect the changes Mr. Geronimo discussed for pit emissions. Operators may now submit reuse and recycling plans as part of a pit or centralized E&P waste management facility permit application, which means that it could be submitted on a Form 15 or Form 28. Staff also made the revision to Rule 905A3I directed by the Commission, which is adding the anticipated method of transporting waste to the reuse and recycling plan. And staff proposes a conforming edit to Rule 304C18C to get the same information about the method of transporting recycled water on a Form 2A water plan, which would be submitted for new facilities rather than the existing facilities covered by Rule 905A3. Next slide, please. As directed by the Commission, staff made 2 revisions to the discussion of Rule 912 in the Statement of Basis and Purpose. First, staff proposed language describing the Commission's intent to work towards developing a system for automatic notification of spills and releases to the general public. This would be in addition to providing continuous updates about spills and releases on the daily activity dashboard on the Commission's website, which is the current practice. Second, staff added language clarifying that an operator reporting a subsurface gas seep will not be presumed responsible for that subsurface gas seep. Next slide, please. Finally, staff proposed 2 revisions to the discussion of Rule 915 and Table 915-1 in the Statement of Basis and Purpose. First, as instructed by the Commission, staff struck the language discussing Rule 915E2C, which previously stated that an exception allowing operators to sample for a limited range of analytes in contaminated soil would be narrow and rarely granted. Regional Environmental Protection Specialist staff will continue their current practice of reviewing whether applying this exception is appropriate on a case-by-case basis based on their significant expertise in regional soil characteristics. Second, staff provided language responding to the Commission's direction to consider the Hazardous Materials and Waste Management Division's definition of remediation. After review, staff determined that aligning the 2 agencies' definitions was unnecessary because each definition serves a different purpose. Staff therefore did not revise the definition. The only change to the definition proposed as part of the mission change rulemaking is to update the reference to current table 910-1 to instead reference proposed table 915-1. And with that, I will turn it back over to Director Murphy for any final comments, and staff are ready to take your questions. We can probably end the presentation.
Thank you, team. Thank you, commissioners, and we are available for questions. I certainly don't think there's anything to clean up after that robust and thorough and well-paced dialogue, I would say.
Thank you, Director Murphy. That was very well done. Really appreciate staff's thorough review and listening to the direction from commissioners. At this time, I would turn to fellow commissioners to see if we have questions of staff at this time. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation. That was really helpful. I think there's a lot of great work in here. One question I had was, in part because maybe I'm not 100% sure I fully understand the designation of the ozone non-attainment zones and whether and how they may change over time. So in part, I was wondering if the naming of the specific counties versus just discussing the ozone non-attainment zone or zones, if that changes in the future. Was there any discussion about that?
If I may, Chair.
Director Murphy.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Commissioner. From an administering the rule, it's easier for us to do it on a countywide basis. And I think that, and so as we look at the non-attainment area, there's a fairly close overlap. If we are going into the space of actually adopting the precise areas designated as non-attainment, we get into the kind of incorporation by reference challenges that come with it. And so as the non-attainment zone changes, we'd need a corollary rulemaking. And so we thought it made it easier and more straightforward and more clear to administer and for stakeholders to understand if we chose a county level designation.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Director Murphy. And so then and that makes sense. Thank you. I appreciate that. And, I do understand that the area, does not follow the the geopolitical boundaries, but in the same vein, then I suppose if that status would change, then we would be able to, in another rulemaking, revise the counties that apply if there was some reason that was appropriate. Is that right?
Commissioner Putnam. Director Murphy.
I think, yes, Commissioner, we could do the non-attainment zone, and yes, we could convene a rulemaking if the non-attainment zone changes, but again, staff thought it was more efficient to administer in this way.
Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa, for that question. Just to provide a little bit more context, the question of the exact boundaries for the non-attainment area has been the subject of litigation in federal court, and EPA is currently in the process of having to address some questions about that. So I think for providing certainty and easier administration, we agree with Director Murphy that the county boundaries will provide a more predictable approach to that and a more stable approach. And the counties listed, I think, capture what we're expecting out of the Denver North Front Range non-attainment area for the immediate future. If we ever get in a position, which we hope to very much avoid, where other parts of the state are designated, then we could always look at a rulemaking change to add those counties. But at this point, I think this captures what we would expect out of the current non-attainment area, which is our largest air quality challenge.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Commissioner Nanjapa, did you have any follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I'd have other questions, but I'll step back and let other commissioners jump in.
Do we have other commissioners on with questions on this topic? Commissioner Nanjapa, I think you can move to your other questions. Looks like there were no questions on this topic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is just a more general question in trying to understand. So in, let's see, 903 D1, sorry, 903 D3, Just to better understand, what would be a circumstance where an operator might lose access to a gathering line, and is there generally a time frame that can be rectified?
Director Murphy?
Thank you. The one big, I think the circumstance staff was referencing is very focused on the Third Creek, the entire system being taken out or decommissioned, or I'm not even sure what the right word is because it's a different regulatory structure. But an entire line was removed and was no longer available to service a large number of wells on the Front Range. That has been a very unique circumstance. And I think that's mostly what we were talking about. I think that there are some less permanent kind of losses of connectivity. But if you want a more specific discussion of how gathering capacity can change, it's probably a better question for operators specifically. But the one instance that staff was referencing, and I would invite Joel to jump in as well, is that kind of permanent removal of a gathering line, period. And that's happened once, as far as I think our staff remembers.
And Mr. Chair, if I may just follow.
Yeah, AG Minor.
Thank you. I think to answer the other part of your question, Commissioner Nanjapa, about how long does it take to fix that, it's really hard to say, and it would vary just so much, really, I think, depending on whether there are other viable gathering systems nearby. If it's an area that has pretty dense gathering infrastructure, it might be a relatively quick proposition to connect to a different gathering system, depending on sort of rights of way and other factors. Of an area with perhaps just one pipeline, might be a matter of staff giving the full 12-month period for an operator to perhaps work out another way to beneficially reuse the gas. So of course, being connected to a gathering line is not the only beneficial use of gas. So I think the flexibility of the 12-month period to address that situation is what staff initially proposed in Rule 903 D3, and it just had to get spelled out a little more clearly now that there are some dates added in there.
Thank you, AG Minor. Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think I know the answer to this, but just to confirm that anyone that is currently flaring has a Form 4, right? So, I mean, there wouldn't be any situation where that wouldn't be the case.
Anyone who's flaring with permission, yes. I mean, people can occasionally ignore our rules, but if to be in compliance, yes, somebody has an approved Form 4.
And as we contemplate staff's suggestion around the more of the rolling date concept, and this may not be an easy question to answer, but is there a significant number of Form 4s that would expire like at the end of 2021 versus like the beginning or the middle of 2021? Do you understand why I'm asking that?
I do understand the question. I'm not sure that I have the data. I think that's something that we could pull together and be prepared to share with you kind of first thing Thursday morning before we jump into party presentations. If we get it in the ensuing 6 minutes, I'll let you know.
No, I appreciate that. And I mean, and that helps with my, as I'm thinking about, potential length of flaring operations, if, 90% of them expire in November of 2022, that's a different contemplation than either them being evenly dispersed throughout 2021, I mean, is what I'm talking about, versus the majority of them being in the first quarter of 2021, right? So.
AG Minor, do you want to add to this discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I would just add that sort of in addition to the number and the timing, one challenge is that they tend to be geographically concentrated. So they fall essentially within the same responsibility of certain engineering staff, right? So we sort of talked about Jackson County, Fremont County, and Lincoln County, which are all in the eastern region as defined for the engineering staff. So the area that Ms. Byrne supervises. So while that's not universally true, it does create sort of unique challenges for workload, just given that they would tend to fall on sort of the same staff that have similar regional expertise and not be sort of evenly distributed throughout the engineering department.
Commissioner Messner.
And along that lines, as far as the geographic layout of these, I assume that the resolution, so whether that's the development of a gas gathering system or the utilization of some other technology that would eliminate the need to flare, that resolution of those situations would probably all happen geographically as well, right? So if we've got a bunch of Form 4s that have permission to flare and we're giving them the 12-month grace period, and at month 6, a gas gathering system comes into place, that may affect, 20 wells or whatever that number is in that particular geographic area. So I think that timing plays into it as well. I'm thinking aloud here a little bit, so I apologize, but.
Does any staff desire to respond?
Chair, we'll try to pull together some more information that would help shape kind of what the flow of Form 4 expirations looks like.
Commissioner Gonzalez, I think you had asked to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I would just think that a schedule of the expirations of Form 4 associated with flaring, if readily accessible, to put that information together would be a helpful piece as we contemplate these options.
I think we've sufficiently given staff direction on that point. So thank you, staff, for that. Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Bowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Apologies if this is a basic question, but is there any inconsistency between permitting pits within 2,000 feet of building units and our setback decisions around the 600 rules that obviously have not been completely approved yet?
Director Murphy?
Commissioner Bogue, I think there's actually a fair amount of synergy, for lack of a better word. We're looking at what's on the ground when a proposed oil and gas development plan or a pit is proposed, but we don't have what happens after that point in time is not within our regulatory authority. So.
Thank you, Director Murphy. Any further questions? All right, I'm not seeing further questions for staff at this time. Thank you again, Director Murphy, for your team's presentation. Would we expect to see the slide online so that folks can look at it a little more closely over the next day or so as they're preparing their closings?
We can get our slides posted, Chair, yes, and the actual revised draft rules and revised draft red line are out as well and were sent out earlier this morning. So yep. Folks have enough time to digest the changes and think through their final remarks. And will be available Thursday for questions as you all continue to digest the information we've presented.
Great. Well, I think we're all going to roll up our sleeves and work through the red line and compare it to the direction that we had suggested. And I know that all of our stakeholders will be doing the same. There's 115 participants online right now. Everyone gets a chance of a little less than 48 hours to gather their collective thoughts, and then we would reconvene on November 5th at 9 a.m. and we would start that morning with party closing statements. Do we have timeframes for that? Hearings Manager Larson, I'm sure we put something together.
We do, Mr. Chair. So the agenda provides that each party receives 5 minutes for their closing statement.
Okay, great. Anything further at this point from commissioners or staff? All right, seeing none, I believe that we're looking for a motion to adjourn this proceeding until November 5th at 9 a.m.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, everybody go do your homework. We will see you in 2 days. And before you do your homework, go vote if you haven't already. Bye.